There's a strange moment that happens quietly in a person's life. Not dramatic, not loud. It's the moment you begin to feel out of sync with the world around you. Conversations start to feel shallow. Certainty feels rehearsed. Opinions sound borrowed, as if spoken by voices that don't fully belong to the people using them. And you start wondering something dangerous. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what if something is wrong with the way we're all thinking? Most people dismiss this feeling. They distract themselves. They scroll, argue, repeat, comply, but a few don't. A few feel an unease they can't shake, the sense that reality itself has become thin, performative, strangely artificial, that people are reacting more than thinking, echoing more than understanding. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Human beings like to believe we are rational creatures, but history tells a different story. Again and again, entire civilizations have drifted into collective illusions, not because people were evil or unintelligent, but because they were afraid of uncertainty, afraid of standing alone, afraid of thinking too deeply in a world that rewards speed over depth. When fear becomes constant, the mind looks for relief. Not truth, relief. And relief often arrives in the form of simplified stories. Clear villains, clear heroes, clear rules for who belongs and who doesn't. Complexity disappears. Nuance becomes suspicious. Questioning feels dangerous. This is how collective confusion begins. Not with madness, but with comfort. When people feel overwhelmed, they don't ask, what's true? They ask, what feels safe? And once safety replaces truth as the highest value, thinking quietly dies. You've seen it happen. People defending ideas they barely understand, attacking questions instead of answering them, reacting emotionally to concepts that require patience and reflection. It's not stupidity. It's something more unsettling. It's psychological surrender. When an individual no longer trusts their own perception, they outsource reality. They let authority decide what's real. They let repetition decide what's acceptable. They let consensus replace conscience. And the moment this happens, the mind becomes programmable. The most disturbing part is this. People inside collective confusion rarely feel confused. They feel righteous, certain, morally justified. Anyone who questions the narrative is labeled dangerous, ignorant, or malicious, not because they're wrong, but because uncertainty threatens the fragile structure holding everything together. So the system defends itself through ridicule, through outrage, through silence, and suddenly thinking becomes lonely. You may have felt this already. That hesitation before speaking honestly. That instinct to soften your thoughts so they don't provoke conflict. That inner voice saying, it's not worth it. That voice isn't wisdom. It's conditioning. Because the deepest human fear is not death. It's isolation. Our minds evolved in tribes. To be cast out once meant you didn't survive. That ancient wiring still lives inside us. Today, exile doesn't mean starvation, it means social rejection, mockery, being labeled problematic, being misunderstood on purpose. So many people stay quiet, not because they agree, but because they don't want to be alone. And silence, repeated long enough, begins to feel like belief. This is how entire populations drift without realizing it. Not forced, not coerced, but gently nudged by fear and fatigue. Over time, thinking is replaced by slogans. Understanding is replaced by allegiance. Identity is built from opinions rather than introspection. And something vital is lost. The ability to sit with uncertainty, to admit, I don't know, to change your mind without shame. You can tell when a society is drifting into confusion, not by what it debates, but by what it refuses to question. When curiosity is framed as hostility. When complexity is treated as deception. When disagreement is equated with moral failure. That's not progress. That's fragility. And yet, here's the paradox. The people most disturbed by this environment often assume they are the problem. They think they're overthinking, too sensitive, too detached, but often it's the opposite. They're reacting to something real. Awareness feels uncomfortable in an environment built on emotional reflex. Clarity feels isolating in a culture addicted to noise. And if you've ever felt that strange tension, the sense that something fundamental is off, but no one wants to slow down long enough to notice, it's not because you're broken, it's because you're still thinking. This doesn't make you superior, it makes you responsible, because awareness carries a cost. Once you see how easily the human mind can be guided, manipulated, and emotionally steered, you can't unsee it. You start noticing patterns, how outrage spreads faster than understanding, how certainty grows strongest where knowledge is weakest, how people cling to ideas not because they're true, but because letting go would collapse their identity. And this realization can feel heavy. You may feel disconnected from conversations that once felt normal. You may feel bored by arguments that go nowhere. You may feel an urge to withdraw, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. This is the first threshold, the moment when you realize that staying mentally free in a confused world requires effort and courage, because the crowd doesn't punish ignorance. It punishes independence. In the next session, we'll go deeper into why intelligent, well-meaning people abandon their own perception, how fear reshapes identity, and the subtle psychological stages that pull entire societies into shared illusions without anyone noticing it's happening. For now, sit with this question quietly. Are you uncomfortable because you're lost, or because you're beginning to see clearly? At some point, awareness stops feeling like insight and starts feeling like friction. You begin to notice how often people speak without listening, how arguments aren't attempts to understand, but performances meant to signal loyalty, how certainty becomes louder as curiosity disappears. This is where many people misunderstand what's happening. They assume society is becoming irrational because people are unintelligent. But intelligence isn't the issue. Fear is. When uncertainty becomes chronic, the human mind does something predictable. It searches for stability, not in truth, but in structure. The brain doesn't crave reality. It craves coherence. And when the world feels chaotic, coherence can be manufactured. Simple narratives, clear enemies, approved opinions. These offer psychological relief. They reduce anxiety. They tell people who they are, what to believe, and where to stand without the painful work of thinking. This is why emotionally charged ideas spread faster than accurate ones. They don't require reflection. They require reaction, and reaction feels like control. But there's a hidden cost. The moment someone adopts a belief to regulate fear rather than seek truth, that belief becomes part of their identity, and once an idea fuses with identity, questioning it feels like a personal attack. That's when dialogue collapses, not because people are incapable of understanding, but because understanding would destabilize who they think they are. So the mind defends itself. It dismisses nuance. It labels dissent. It reframes doubt as danger. You've likely seen this shift happen in real time. Conversations that once allowed disagreement now feel rigid. Opinions harden into moral positions. Evidence becomes less important than alignment. This is not accidental. It's psychological self-preservation. When people feel powerless, belonging becomes more valuable than truth, and belonging requires agreement. So the individual trades perception for acceptance. This trade often happens silently, no dramatic decision, no conscious surrender, just a gradual adjustment. You stop questioning publicly. You repeat what feels safe. You adopt the language of the group. Over time, this repetition shapes thought. Beliefs you once tolerated become beliefs you defend. Ideas you once doubted become ideas you identify with. And the most dangerous moment arrives quietly. It's when someone believes they are thinking independently while actually reacting predictably. This is the illusion of autonomy. The person feels free because no one is physically forcing them. Yet their emotional responses are guided, their outrage is triggered on command, their attention is steered with precision. They are not controlled through force. They are controlled through meaning, or rather, the lack of it. When life feels empty, external narratives rush in to fill the void. When purpose is absent, ideology substitutes for identity. And this is where mass confusion becomes aggressive. Because a fragile belief system cannot tolerate challenge. The more someone depends on a narrative to feel grounded, the more threatening alternative perspectives become. So disagreement isn't met with curiosity, it's met with hostility. Not because the challenger is wrong, but because they destabilize psychological safety. This is why emotionally calm people are often perceived as dangerous. They're not reactive. They don't mirror outrage. They don't signal allegiance. They think. And thinking is contagious, but also risky. You may have noticed that when you remain calm during emotionally charged discussions, others become uncomfortable. They may escalate, mock, interrupt. Not because you're aggressive, but because you refuse to participate in emotional synchronization. You're not matching the frequency. And that exposes something unsettling. That many people don't actually know why they believe what they believe. They just know how it feels to belong. This creates a strange inversion. The person asking questions is labeled ignorant. The person repeating slogans is labeled informed. The person slowing down is seen as resistant. The person reacting instantly is seen as virtuous. In this environment, clarity feels lonely, and loneliness becomes the price of awareness. This is where many people retreat. They stop engaging. They disengage mentally. They isolate emotionally. But isolation is not the answer. Because withdrawing without understanding simply creates another form of fragmentation. The goal is not to escape society. It's to remain sovereign within it. And that requires something most people are never taught. Internal separation, not emotional numbness, not superiority, but the ability to observe without absorbing, to listen without merging, to think without immediately identifying. This is where true mental independence begins. You start noticing your own reactions before acting on them. You question your emotional impulses instead of obeying them. You pause where others rush. And in that pause, something important happens. You regain authorship of your mind. You realize that many thoughts are not yours. They are inherited, suggested, repeated. Once you see this, you can choose which ideas deserve residence and which ones don't. This doesn't make life easier, it makes it clearer. You may feel grief for conversations that can't happen, for relationships built on agreement rather than understanding, for a world that rewards noise over depth. But clarity always carries grief, because seeing clearly means seeing what is missing. And yet, something else emerges, a quieter strength. You stop needing to convince. You stop needing to perform. You stop needing validation. Your sense of self detaches from reaction, and when that happens, influence changes shape. You no longer persuade through argument. You influence through presence. People sense when someone is not being pulled by the same currents. It unsettles them, but it also intrigues them, because deep down, many feel the same confusion. They just haven't stopped long enough to name it. In the final session, we'll explore the last and most difficult step: how to live fully awake without becoming bitter, how to remain compassionate without surrendering clarity, and how true freedom doesn't come from opposing the crowd, but from no longer needing it. There comes a moment when awareness matures into something deeper. At first, seeing clearly feels isolating, then it feels heavy, and finally, if you stay with it long enough, it becomes calm. Not because the world improved, but because you no longer need it to. This is the part few people talk about. Most discussions about awakening focus on resistance, fighting narratives, exposing manipulation, pointing out illusions. But if awareness stops there, it hardens into bitterness. True freedom begins only when clarity no longer requires opposition, because the final trap of collective confusion is not belief, it is dependency. Dependency on agreement, dependency on reaction, dependency on being seen as right. When you release the need to be validated by the crowd, something subtle changes. Your thoughts slow down, your emotions soften, your attention turns inward, not to escape reality, but to anchor within it. You realize that mass confusion survives because people are terrified of standing alone with their own minds. Silence scares them. Stillness exposes them. Without constant input, many don't know who they are, so they stay busy, outraged, engaged in endless commentary, but the one who can sit quietly without distraction becomes immune. Not superior, not detached, just rooted. This is where real independence begins. You stop measuring your thoughts against approval. You stop scanning rooms, digital or physical, to see what's acceptable. You stop asking, how will this be received? And start asking, is this true for me? That shift is small, but irreversible. From here, clarity no longer feels like isolation. It feels like alignment. You still see the illusions. You still recognize emotional manipulation. You still notice how easily people are steered by fear. But you're no longer consumed by it, because you've discovered something critical. You don't need to save the world to be free from it. You only need to govern your own mind. This doesn't mean apathy. It means precision. You choose when to speak and when to stay silent. You choose which conversations deserve energy. You choose where your attention goes, because attention is the true currency of influence. And this choice changes everything. Instead of reacting, you respond. Instead of absorbing chaos, you observe it. Instead of being pulled into collective emotion, you stand just far enough back to see clearly. This creates a strange effect. People may still disagree with you, but they no longer provoke you. They may still project, but it no longer sticks. They may still misunderstand, but it no longer destabilizes you, because your identity is no longer built from reflection. It's built from coherence. You begin to live differently. You speak less, but with more weight. You listen more, but absorb less. You act deliberately instead of reflexively, and others notice, not because you're louder, but because you're steady. This steadiness is rare. In a world addicted to stimulation, calm becomes magnetic. In a culture fueled by outrage, restraint becomes powerful. You don't need to convince people you're free. Freedom is visible. It shows in how little you need to prove, how little you need to defend, how little you need to be right. This is the paradox. The moment you stop trying to wake people up, you become the thing that wakes them. Not through arguments, not through force, but through example. Because clarity has a frequency, and those who are ready feel it. They may not articulate it, they may not even agree with you, but something in them recognizes something in you. A calm they've forgotten, a stability they've never been taught, a presence that doesn't demand conformity. This is how real change spreads. Quietly, indirectly, organically. And it begins with one decision: to stop outsourcing your mind, to stop surrendering your perception to noise, to stop confusing belonging with truth, to be willing to stand alone, not in arrogance, but in honesty. Because the ultimate escape from collective confusion is not isolation, it is inner sovereignty. A mind that cannot be hijacked, an identity that doesn't fracture under pressure, a self that remains intact even when the world doesn't make sense. This doesn't make life perfect, but it makes it real, and reality, even when uncomfortable, is lighter than illusion. So if you felt different, if you felt out of sync, if you sensed that something subtle but fundamental is wrong with how the world thinks, it's not because you're broken, it's because you're awake enough to notice. And now the responsibility is simple, but not easy. Protect your clarity, refine your awareness, live without needing permission to think. The world doesn't need louder voices, it needs steadier minds. And that begins quietly with you.